Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This is the show where we take some really fascinating source material and then try to distill it down for you guys so you don't have to go read it all yourselves.
And today we are diving into the world of a pretty influential Islamic philosopher named Shihabuddin Yahya Suhrawardi, who lived in the 12th century. He's also known as Shaykh al-Ishraq.
Shaykh al-Ishraq. Okay. And what does that mean?
It means the master of illumination.
Okay, cool. So this guy Suhrawardi was a pretty big deal in his time, huh?
Yeah, he founded a whole school of thought called the School of Illumination and had a massive impact on Eastern Islamic philosophy.
Wow, okay. And what are we going to be looking at today to learn about this guy?
We have a few things, actually. We've got a YouTube transcript from Let's Talk Religion, along with some excerpts from this book by Mehdi Amin Razavi called Suhrawardi and the School of Illumination. Oh, and also, there's another PDF about his life and work.
Okay, sounds like we've got a lot to cover. So what exactly are we going to be trying to figure out in this deep dive?
Well, our main mission is to get a better understanding of Suhrawardi's groundbreaking ideas and to see why this medieval Islamic philosopher is still relevant today.
Cool. Yeah, I'm always interested in how ideas from centuries ago can still have an impact on us today. So let's start with the basics. Who was Suhrawardi and where did he come from?
He was born in 1154 in a village called Suhraward in the Zanjan province of modern-day Iran. This area was in the foothills of the mountains that separate Azerbaijan from the central Iranian plateau.
Okay. And what was that region like back then?
It was a mix of cultures with Azeri and Kurdish people, so he was exposed to a lot of different influences growing up.
Interesting. So not just like a purely Islamic environment, but a place with influences from different traditions.
Right. And speaking of his life, he lived from 1154 to 1191 CE.
So only 37 years. That's not very long. Did he do a lot in that time?
Oh, yeah, he packed a lot into those years. He traveled throughout Iran, Anatolia, and Syria, and he was known for being both a dedicated ascetic and a really sharp intellectual.
Ascetic, meaning he lived a simple life focused on spiritual discipline.
Exactly. He really valued solitude and the natural world, and he wasn't afraid to challenge people intellectually, which actually ended up getting him the nickname Shaykh Makdul.
Okay. And what does that mean?
The slain master. But his disciples called him Shaykh Shahid,
Which means?
the witness. So you can see even his titles reflect the kind of contradictory perceptions of him.
Wow, the slain master versus the witness. That's heavy stuff. So tell me more about his education. Like, where did he learn all of this?
Well, he started off studying with Majd al-Din Ajili in Maragha, where he learned philosophy and theology.
And then?
Then he moved to Isfahan, a really important center of learning, and studied logic under Zahir al-Din al-Qari.
Okay, so he had a pretty solid grounding in the Islamic intellectual tradition.
Absolutely. And even more interesting is that his teacher, Zahir al-Din al-Qari, introduced him to the work of Ibn Salan al-Sawi.
Okay, who's that?
He had written a commentary on Avicenna's Treatise of the Birds, which was a really famous philosophical work. And you know what? Later on, Suhrawardi actually translated and reinterpreted that very work himself into Persian.
Really? Wow, that's dedication to your intellectual roots.
For sure. And it also shows how he wasn't afraid to build upon the work of the great thinkers who came before him.
So what else can you tell me about his teachers? Did they get along with him? Was he a good student?
Well, one of his teachers, Fakhr al-Din al-Mardini, was a bit concerned about him.
What do you mean?
Well, he really admired Suhrawardi's intelligence, but thought he could be too audacious.
Oh, really? Too bold for his own good.
Exactly. He called him reckless, even. So it seems he was already causing a stir with his ideas even back then.
So it sounds like he was not your typical student just memorizing texts, but really engaging with them, questioning things.
Definitely. And his education wasn't limited to formal schooling.
What else did he do?
Well, during his travels, he embraced the Sufi path. He was hanging out with all sorts of learned scholars and Sufi mystics.
Okay, so Sufism, that's the mystical branch of Islam, right? They're known for their practices and their emphasis on a direct experience of the divine.
You got it. And we even have accounts from his biographer, Shahrazuri, about how intensely he practiced Sufism. Like, he fasted a lot and ate super simply.
Wow. So this guy was not messing around. He was deeply committed to both the intellectual and the spiritual sides of things.
Yeah, and this commitment definitely shaped his worldview and influenced his philosophical ideas.
And what about his, personal style? What did he look like? Did he dress in fancy robes like you see in paintings of some philosophers?
Actually, no. He typically dressed in simple clothes, often a red hat and a dervish coat.
So a very down-to-earth, minimalist kind of vibe.
Exactly. This actually ties into his Kurdish heritage. And the sources paint a fascinating picture of his personality. Bahagi described his inner spirit as a wild horse, always seeking solitude and union with God.
I like that. A wild horse.
Yeah, and this gives us a glimpse into his inner world and how he saw himself. He wasn't focused on outward appearances or fancy speeches.
But he still made a strong impression, right?
Oh yeah, his presence definitely spoke volumes. There's even a story about him being mistaken for a donkey driver because of his simple clothes.
Seriously. That's funny. I guess you can't judge a book by its cover. Especially not a philosopher like Suhrawardi.
Absolutely. But even though he loves simplicity, he could adapt to different social settings. He could clean up nice for court when needed.
Okay, so he wasn't a total hermit then.
Not at all. And despite his love for solitude, he also enjoyed the ecstatic dances and music of the Sufis.
Oh yeah, the Sama.
Exactly. It was a way for him to connect with the divine through music and movement.
So he was a complex guy, balancing intense spirituality with intellectual pursuits.
Absolutely. And speaking of intellect, he was a real powerhouse. He knew a lot about Islamic law and hadith and was a master logician.
And he was also familiar with different philosophical traditions.
Yeah. Yes. He was well-versed in peripatetic philosophy, which is basically Aristotelian thought, but he also knew about Neoplatonism and Zoroastrianism.
So he wasn't just limited to the Islamic intellectual tradition. He was drawing from a wide range of sources.
Absolutely. He was synthesizing ideas from different cultures and philosophies, which makes his work even more fascinating to study, in my opinion.
And it sounds like he was pretty good at debating.
Oh, he was famous for it. People said he could humiliate his opponents in public discussions with his sharp logic and arguments, even in court, like at the court of Malik al-Zahir in Aleppo.
Wow, he didn't hold back. So what did he think of himself intellectually?
Well, he was definitely confident in his abilities. He actually claimed to be equal to or even slightly better than the famous philosopher Avicenna in discursive knowledge.
Discursive knowledge.
That's basically knowledge gained through reason and argumentation. But more importantly, he believed he surpassed Avicenna in revelatory and intuitive knowledge.
Okay, so knowledge that comes from a direct experience or maybe inspiration, not just from logical thinking.
Exactly. That distinction is actually super important for understanding his whole philosophical project.
Okay, we'll definitely have to come back to that. But first, any other interesting tidbits about his life?
Well, there's this possible connection to Shamsi Tabrizi, which is pretty cool.
Wait, Shamsi Tabrizi, as in the spiritual mentor of Rumi.
The very same.
Wow, that's a wild connection.
It is. Their paths might have crossed at some point. And what's interesting is that Shams's writings don't really say much about Suhrawardi's execution later on, but they do mention that he really disliked money.
He saw it as a source of trouble, huh?
Yeah, which is kind of a common theme among mystics and ascetics throughout history.
Makes sense. Okay, but not everything about him was positive,
Yeah.
right? You mentioned earlier that he might have held some problematic views.
Right. Unfortunately, the sources suggest he had some pretty misogynistic views.
What do you mean?
He seemed to believe that women were inherently weaker than men spiritually and associated women with a lower level of spiritual development. Ugh, that's disappointing to hear, even from a brilliant mind like his.
It is. It reminds us that even the greatest thinkers can be products of their time and hold beliefs that we find abhorrent today.
For sure. We have to be able to acknowledge those flaws, even while we appreciate their contributions. So, moving on from that, let's talk about his political life. I know he was interested in this idea of divine governance. What exactly does that mean?
It's basically the idea that the ideal ruler is guided by divine principles and acts as God's representative on earth. And Suhrawardi actually developed this concept further by introducing the idea of the Imam philosopher.
The Imam philosopher. So basically a ruler who's not just politically savvy, but also deeply wise and spiritually enlightened.
Exactly, someone who embodies both wisdom and authority. And he wasn't just theorizing about this, he actually tried to put this idea into practice.
Really? He actively sought patronage from various Seljuk rulers. He also connected with Al-Malik al-Zahir, who was Saladin's son. He was really hoping to find a ruler who would embody this ideal of the Imam philosopher and usher in a golden age of wisdom and justice.
Ambitious. So how did that work out for him?
Not so well, unfortunately. This political engagement ended up being one of the main reasons for his downfall.
Oh no, what happened?
Well, around 1183, he arrived in Aleppo and befriended the young prince, Al-Malik al-Zahir, who was pretty receptive to his ideas, but he also attracted a lot of enemies.
Why? What did they accuse him of?
His opponents started spreading rumors that he held views that were against Islamic law. They accused him of claiming prophethood and even performing miracles.
So basically they painted him as a heretic, someone who was threatening the established religious order.
Exactly, and they pressured al-Malik to execute him.
Oh wow, that escalated quickly.
Yeah.
And did the prince give in to the pressure?
He initially resisted, but eventually he caved to the demands of his father, Saladin. Apparently, Saladin was influenced by this prominent judge named Qadi al-Fadil, who was no fan of Suhrawardi.
Oh man, so basically his association with this controversial philosopher became too risky for the prince.
Yeah, it was a dangerous time to be challenging the status quo.
So how did he die? Was it a public execution?
The sources actually give different accounts of his death. Some say he was imprisoned and starved to death. Others say he was strangled or killed by the sword. There's even a story about him being thrown from the citadel and burned.
Wow, that's brutal. So no one really knows for sure what happened.
Right. But the historian Ibn Khaldun places his death in January 1192. So at least we have a rough date.
Okay. And it's important to remember the context of all this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This was a period of intense religious and political upheaval. There was a shift in power from Shiite to Sunni dominance in northern Syria. The Crusades were raging, and Saladin was consolidating his power.
So Suhrawardi's ideas about a universal truth that went beyond religious boundaries probably seemed very threatening to those in power.
Exactly. And then you add in his ideas about a philosopher king and the rumors of him claiming prophethood. Well, it's not surprising that he was seen as a dangerous figure.
It's tragic, but in a way understandable.
Right, especially if he was intentionally trying to create a radical new branch of philosophy and mysticism that challenged the establishment.
So despite his controversial end, Suhrawardi was clearly a remarkable figure. He had this fascinating ability to connect seemingly disparate ideas and traditions. You mentioned earlier that he drew inspiration from all sorts of sources.
Oh yeah, he was really interested in synthesizing knowledge. He studied Zoroastrianism, Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Hermeticism.
Hold on, Hermeticism, that's like ancient Egyptian mysticism, right?
Yeah, it's a tradition attributed to this mythical figure, Hermes Trismegistus, who's associated with all sorts of esoteric wisdom.
Wow, so he really cast a wide net in his search for truth.
He did. And he believed that all these different traditions ultimately stemmed from a single source of wisdom. This source had been revealed to prophets and sages throughout history, like Idris, who's often identified with Hermes.
Okay, so he saw a kind of universal wisdom that transcended cultural and religious boundaries.
Exactly. And he believed that his own philosophy was helping to bring all these scattered pieces of wisdom back together.
So he was like a unifier of sorts, trying to create a grand synthesis of knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's why he called his system Philosophia Perennis et Universalis, which means perennial and universal wisdom.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it really captures the essence of his project.
I can see how that would be appealing, this idea that there's a common thread of wisdom running through all these different traditions.
And his influence didn't end with his death. He actually had a lasting impact on Islamic philosophy, influencing thinkers like Mullah Sadra, who came after him.
Really? So his ideas continued to resonate even after he was gone?
Oh, yeah. And his work even spread as far as India, where it inspired a whole school of thought called the Ishraqi school, founded by Azar Kayvan.
Wow, that's impressive. So why isn't he more well-known in the West then?
That's a good question. It probably has something to do with the fact that his works were not translated into Latin until much later, so they weren't really accessible to European scholars for a long time.
Ah, that makes sense. Well, hopefully he's getting more recognition now, because his ideas seem really relevant to me, even today.
I agree. Okay, ready to delve into some of his key philosophical concepts?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm particularly interested in this idea of knowledge by presence that you mentioned earlier.
Okay, so this concept is really central to his thinking, and it's actually based on a dream he had.
A dream? Come on, you're kidding.
I'm serious. He dreamt that he met Aristotle, though it might have actually represented Plotinus, whose writings were sometimes attributed to Aristotle back then. Anyway, in this dream, he asks Aristotle the most fundamental question. How do we gain knowledge?
And what did Dream Aristotle say?
He said, think introvertively of yourself. Basically, he's saying that the most direct and certain kind of knowledge we have is the knowledge of our own self.
Okay, I can see that. Like, I don't need proof from the outside world to know that I exist. I just know it directly.
Exactly. And Suhrawardi makes a distinction between this kind of direct knowledge, which he calls knowledge by presence, and what he calls knowledge by correspondence.
So what's the difference?
Knowledge by correspondence is when our mind creates a mental image or representation of something external. Like, if I see a tree, my mind forms an image of that tree.
Right.
But knowledge by presence is a direct awareness without any intermediary.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So, for Suhrawardi, the most fundamental kind of knowledge is the direct, unmediated awareness of our own self.
You got it. And he goes on to argue that self-knowledge can't actually occur through representation.
What does that mean?
Well, if I only know myself through a mental image, then that image is a separate thing from the actual reality of me.
Oh, I see. Like, if I'm looking at a mental picture of myself, how do I even know that picture is accurate? And how do I know that it's even me that I'm picturing?
Precisely. It leads to this infinite regress problem, because then you'd need another representation to know that representation and so on.
Yeah, that sounds like a rabbit hole I don't want to go down.
He actually has a quote about this. He says, "A thing that exists in itself and is conscious of itself does not know itself through a representation of itself appearing in itself."
Okay, so he's saying that when it comes to self-awareness, being and knowing are basically the same thing. There's no separation.
Exactly. And he takes this idea even further and applies it to all knowledge.
All knowledge, even knowledge of the external world.
Yes, he argues that all knowledge is ultimately grounded in this direct presence.
So even when we have conceptual knowledge, like when I form a mental concept of, say, justice or freedom, that knowledge is still based on the direct presence of that concept to my consciousness.
Precisely. To know anything, even a concept, it must be present to our awareness. And that awareness, that presence, is what's fundamental.
Okay, I think I'm following you. So it's not just about self-knowledge. It's about how all knowledge is rooted in this direct, unmediated presence.
Exactly. He's basically challenging the idea that certainty comes from the outside world. He's saying that the most certain knowledge is the knowledge we have of our own being.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. And it really sets the stage for his other philosophical ideas, like his philosophy of lights, which we can talk about now.
Okay, I'm ready for some illumination. So what is this philosophy of lights all about?
Well, it's called Hikmat al-Ishraq in Arabic, and it's basically a system of thought that emphasizes the concept of light, or nur in Arabic, as the most fundamental reality.
Okay, but he's not talking about physical light, right?
Right.
Like the light from the sun.
Not exactly. While physical light is a manifestation of it, the concept of nur is much broader. It refers to the very principle of knowability, of something being apparent or manifest.
So anything that can be known is, in a sense, illuminated by this nur.
Precisely. He argues that physical light actually depends on something else to be visible, like it needs a medium, like air or water, to travel through. But this fundamental light, this nur, it doesn't depend on anything else. It is inherently self-illuminating.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. So physical light needs something to make it apparent, but this fundamental light is self-apparent. It just is.
Exactly. And Suhrawardi says that this physical light must have an immaterial cause, something that is pure light, pure consciousness.
Okay, and what is this immaterial cause? What's it like?
He uses this great analogy of a picture reflected in a mirror. The image appears in the mirror, but it's not actually imprinted on the surface. It has a different kind of existence.
So this immaterial light is like the source of all illumination, but it's also conscious of itself.
Yes. And he goes on to say that there's a whole hierarchy of these immaterial lights, varying in their intensity and perfection.
So some lights are brighter than others.
You could say that. And at the top of this hierarchy is the light of lights, the Nur al-Anwar, which is the ultimate source of all existence.
Okay, so this is like the ultimate, most brilliant light from which all other lights emanate.
Exactly. And the closer something is to this light of lights, the more illuminated it is and the more knowable it is.
So everything in existence is basically participating in this light of lights to some degree.
Precisely.
Okay, now, how does this philosophy of lights connect back to the idea of knowledge by presence?
Yeah.
They seem pretty closely related.
They are totally connected. Remember how we talked about how the self is directly aware of itself? Well, Suhrawardi says that the self that knows is actually a kind of immaterial light.
So our very ability to be aware, to know, is rooted in this fundamental reality of light. That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is, and it's a really key idea in his philosophy.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how this all fits together. He's presenting a worldview where light is not just something physical, but a fundamental principle of reality that is connected to consciousness and knowledge.
Exactly, and it's a worldview that has deep roots in both Islamic and pre-Islamic thought.
Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to ask you about this idea of Herkalia, the world of the image.
Ah, yes. This is one of the most intriguing parts of his philosophy.
It sounds pretty mystical. What is it exactly?
Well, Suhrawardi introduces the concept of Herkalia to explain mystical experiences and visions. He describes it as a spiritual interworld, a land of nowhere, or Nakoja Abad in Persian.
A land of nowhere. I like that.
Yeah, it's a pretty evocative image, and he says it's located somewhere between the realm of abstract ideas and the sensible world of physical forms.
So it's like a bridge between the world of pure thought and the world we perceive with our senses.
You could say that. It's a place where spirits can take on bodily forms and material things can become spiritualized, kind of like what they call a barzakh in Islamic thought.
A barzakh, that's often translated as isthmus or barrier, right? Like a liminal space between two worlds.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what kinds of things exist in this world of the image?
He says that for everything in our physical world, there is a corresponding counterpart in Herkalia. So there are images of physical objects, but also angelic beings. And all of this is perceptible to our inner senses, to our imagination.
So it's like a world that we can access through our imagination.
Yes. And he says that this is the realm where dreams take place, especially lucid dreams, where you're aware that you're dreaming. It's also the realm of myths and symbols and poetic inspiration.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So it's like a world of pure imagination, but it's also somehow real.
Right. And he emphasizes that the forms we experience in Herkalia are not materially imprinted anywhere. They're more like those mirror images we were talking about before. They appear, but they don't physically exist in the mirror.
Oh, I see. So they're like bodies in suspension, as he puts it.
Exactly. And he believes that there are certain figures in Herkalia that are especially important, like Habash, the angel of the sun.
Okay, and why is Habash so important?
He sees Habash as a kind of intermediary between the light of lights and the rest of creation.
Okay, so this angel is like a channel for the divine light.
Exactly. And he also talks about encountering the souls of the past in a Herkalia.
Whoa. So we could potentially connect with the wisdom of those who came before us in this realm.
He seems to suggest that, yes.
Okay, so our ability to perceive this world of the image, it must depend on our inner state, right? Like how developed our imagination is or how spiritually attuned we are.
Absolutely. The clearer our inner vision, the more we can perceive in Herkalia.
And how do we develop that inner vision?
Through self-knowledge, that knowledge by presence we were talking about. By detaching from the material world and going inward, we can cultivate this direct perception of the spiritual realm.
So it's like a kind of spiritual training where we refine our inner senses to become more receptive to these subtle realities.
Exactly. And remember how he said that the self is a kind of light? Well, he believes that by deepening our self-knowledge, we're essentially increasing our luminosity, allowing us to perceive other luminous realities.
Okay, so the more illuminated we are, the more we can see in Herkalia.
Yeah, precisely. And this is where mystical perception comes in, what he calls witnessing illumination, or mushahada ishraq.
So this is like a direct, unmediated experience of the divine light.
Yes. It's when a luminous subject comes into direct contact with a luminous object, both bathed in the radiance of the light of lights. It's a pretty profound idea.
It is, and it all connects back to those core concepts of light and presence.
Exactly. And this idea of Herkalia adds another layer to his already complex philosophy.
It's a reminder that there's more to reality than what we can see and touch.
And that our inner world, our imagination, can be a powerful tool for accessing these deeper truths.
Well, Suhrawardi's ideas are definitely thought-provoking. We've talked about his ascetic life, his intellectual brilliance, his controversial views, his tragic death, and his fascinating philosophical system. It's a lot to take in.
He was a complex and controversial figure, but there's no doubt that he was a brilliant and influential thinker. His concept of knowledge by presence is groundbreaking, and his philosophy of lights offers a really unique perspective on the nature of reality.
And his idea of Herkalia, the world of the image, is just so intriguing.
It is, and it's a reminder that there's always more to explore, more to discover, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking some of Suhrawardi's key ideas today.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground.
And hopefully we've given our listeners a good starting point for further exploration. Because Suhrawardi's ideas, though challenging, are definitely worth engaging with.
They are. And even though he lived centuries ago, his ideas still resonate today, especially his emphasis on the importance of direct, intuitive knowledge and the interconnectedness of all things through this fundamental reality of light.
Yeah. And maybe, just maybe, by reflecting on his ideas, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the world of Suhrawardi. I hope you found it illuminating.
It was a pleasure.
And until next time, keep diving.